Well, Pat, we're here for the next episode of Talkin Thrones, and all that I have to say is, Pat, when you play the Game of Thrones, do you win or do you die?
Well, I think on Talkin TV, we know the answer to this. We've all seen this show before, and the answer that we get for the rest of the series is you die.
I feel like the shirt that I'm wearing right now just perfectly applies to what Ned Stark should have done in this episode. But people, in case you didn't notice, this is the Talkin TV segment entitled Talkin Thrones, in which we break down weekly every single episode of Game of Thrones. We're on season 1, episode 7, entitled You Win or You Die. Coming up. Well, Pat, we're officially here. We're on the second half of the season, and this is definitely where the shit goes down, to quote it in layman's terms. This is definitely.
I just thought about this. You say we win, we die, and I think a lot of the people in this episode actually
They don't win. They actually do die. There's not a whole lot of winning.
Yeah, is there anybody that's in this episode that actually makes it to the end of the series?
Oh crap! Wait a minute. Oh, now you got me thinking. Well, obviously Arya. We know Arya.
Yeah, but is Arya in this episode? I think she's.
Crap!
She's not really in it.
Oh wait. Oh shit! No, I'm getting a lot of last episode confused with this episode. You're right. There's not so much actually with Sansa and Arya in this episode. You're right. Oh
like
man,
Littlefinger goes.
It's just it's just Jon and Sam then. If we're going by that logic, then it's just Jon and Sam. Those are the only two.
Yeah, true. I forgot about the Night's Watch. The people at the wall.
Yeah, but even again, like of those people, it's literally just Jon and Sam that makes it. Every one of those guys dies as well.
Yeah, like Jamie doesn't make it.
Jamie doesn't make it.
Tywin doesn't.
Tywin
make
definitely
it.
doesn't make it. Nope.
Robert, as we know, doesn't make it.
See, when you posed that question, I had thought that you were originally talking about like this episode individually, and I'm like, oh, they're definitely winners, but I didn't realize you were talking about like the grand overall scheme of things, and I'm like, in that case.
Do you think they did that on purpose? Like pretty much, we know all these characters are going to die. Let's just make this episode about
I don't know. They could have. It's very, very plausible as far as that goes. I mean, I still think that George R.R. Martin's overall goal is just to murder everyone in this show. Like, I think he even like had written at one point, like the final shot of this entire series would be just the winds of winter flow over a row, just like miles upon miles of gravestones, basically.
Well, it could have been like a Princess Bride type of thing where someone's reading a book and then nuclear winter over the world.
True.
That could have been.
That's how that would end.
Ended this series. But
I always wondered.
Yeah, I don't know. Whatever. That's maybe a little bit of a bad joke there, but for the most part,
no such things as bad jokes on the Talkin Thrones podcast.
I think we talk about this often, where it's. Essentially like the old generation, the people that have the established order and they're, sort of worried about the Game of Thrones. They're the ones that end up sort of losing and dying and sort of being weeded out. And then you have essentially the younger generation take over at the end of the series.
Yeah.
So I just, I wonder how much we see that theme throughout the entire thing.
It's definitely, this is the beginning of that. This is this episode, right? We talked about this with the last two episodes, right? Golden Crown and Wolf and the Lion, where we're basically like, we're getting set up for like the shit is about to go down between the Starks and the Lannisters, and we're going to see that ripple effect and how it spreads and affects overall the rest of the realm, right? We see it obviously with Catelyn's actions. We're going to see it up in Winterfell later on with Robb's response the next episode, and then over subsequent seasons, how it affects other characters to begin to come into the fold, Like, again, it's always been to me the major the staying power to me that Game of Thrones has is having these one events kind of spread out and ripple and encompass everyone, kind of like how it happens in real life, basically. And this is, I feel like, the culmination of it, right? But it's weird because this series of episodes that we find ourselves in the second half of season 1, right? We spent the first 4 episodes like with so much buildup and so much slow stuff. but there's a reason why it was so needed, because we see how like just one thing constantly leads to another as far as how the conflict in this entire show goes. And the interesting thing about this episode specifically is that it really is, like, to me, the perfect, like, house of cards, how it's assembled. Like, how it's assembled from the opening shot all the way, you know, followed by the confrontation, and then all the way, all the working pieces, even with the subsequent storylines, all the way up to the end of that final ultimate betrayal, right? Like, there's a lot of big events that happen in this episode, right? Jon takes his vows. You know, the Khal Drogo officially decides that that the Dothraki are going to ride out and conquer Westeros for Daenerys, right? Ned confronts Cersei with the truth, right? We finally get introduced to Tywin Lannister, right? The big Lannister patriarch, right? Who's the only man in the Seven Kingdoms who could, like, have any control over Jaime and Cersei. And, like, you see that, and like, this guy's...
That's the opening of the episode, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's like Jaime is in his father's tent, and essentially, Tywin is just casually butchering
a deer. Very symbolic again. Like,
is it a
one
deer
loves to drop those symbols.
It's
a giant stag.
boar.
It's a stag, basically.
Oh, it is a stag. Okay.
It is a stag. Again, the symbolism of, like, right back to the first episode with, like, the stag with the spear with its antler stuck through the wolf's throat, right? That the wolf would get betrayed by the stag, and now we have the lion just skinning the stag, basically. A lot of animal symbolism here, just in this first season.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that conversation that he has with Jaime, clearly Tywin's disappointed in Jaime's choices, and there's a little friction there. And he goes into this whole diatribe about, like, you know, we'll be, you know, your mother's rotting in the grave, I'll be rotting in the grave, you'll be rotting in the grave, Tyrion will be rotting in the grave, and the only thing that lives on is family. And we don't want to end up like the Targaryens, where our family just falls apart. And I think, you know, this is like a really strong scene.
Talk about self-fulfilling prophecy right there.
Yeah, but it brings up this whole idea of, you know, the families and those being really important to this world. And, you know, I don't know. Do you think that this series really handles that theme perfectly throughout the entire series? Or do you think at some point it sort of drops this idea of, like, the families at war, and it just focuses on those individual characters that we actually, you know, enjoy?
No, actually, I think that it enacts exactly what it intended to. Weirdly enough, I think that's one of the few kind of overarching themes that actually does get well translated to the finale, which is that idea in and of itself is inherent. While it's true in concept, the overall practice of it by the characters is inherently bullshit. Because even though Tywin may believe in that idea, but he's perfectly willing to throw his own son that he doesn't like to the wolves, right? And then he gives that one flimsy excuse to Tyrion at the end of season 3. But we know for a fact Jaime doesn't care about that. We know for a fact Cersei does not care about that at all. The only thing she cares about is her kids and her own, like, kind of fledgling grasp. And like I said, when her kids are all gone, dead and gone, like, we see what happens there. I think Tyrion does realize it, but by the time he does, it's too late, because he realizes that the only remaining members of that line don't care about him and completely disown him, right? That's why he's, like, content with, like, letting the family lineage die with him, you know? Like, I think that's also part of the reason why he was fighting so hard for Jaime and Cersei to survive, is so that the family, the Lannister name, could in a weird way live on through them, because he knew that it wasn't going to with him, right? But ultimately, right, like, that's... weirdly enough, I think one of the things that, like, the show gets right kind of throughout is that traditionalist idea of these ancient family lines that will continue forever on, even that comes to an end, right? Nothing lasts forever. Everything is ultimately built on this house of cards that is destined to crumble, right? It's why we have people in there like Littlefinger and Varys to kind of remind us that, yeah, at the end of the day, this whole idea of family lineage, it ultimately doesn't matter, right? It's a good idea in concept, right? But the problem is the way that it's practiced by the royal family is simply only as, like, a means to flex and continue to take control. That idea inherently in and of itself is rather outdated, and it's kind of the destruction of that idea that is one of the many that Martin chose to pursue through this series.
Awesome. You know, it's I guess, you know, you put it in such eloquent words, but I don't know if, like, the destruction of this family line is, like, a predominant storyline. You know, it definitely does happen, because, you know, at the end of the day, it's sort of like a council of, you know, survivors of this sort of clash between the Starks and, you know, the Lannisters. And, you know, it basically, after this last big war of families happens, you know, we're left with this idea that will never happen again. But right. I don't know. It seems like it's very much becomes an undertone of the show than an all-out sort of in-your-face affair. So I don't know if this show, you could say it's like the downfall of the family names and, proliferation of, the idea of more collaboration across families.
Right.
But I guess it's because it ends right there at the moment where it's like, oh, hey, we got to do something better. Right. Let's let Tyrion decide.
Yeah. Well, that's one of many instances in which it's handled wrong. But I think the kind of overall point that I'm getting at is this idea of kind of these traditionalist tendencies thinking that they can last forever, right? We talk about this, right? Part of the problem of like destabilization of civilizations is their unwillingness to change and adapt with the times. And honestly, like at certain points, like not even just unwillingness, just inability to do so, right? And that's kind of what we see happen to a lot of the previous generations. I feel like that's a big thing, is that to me is the predominant theme of this episode specifically. It's quite literally, you win or you die. You adapt to the new way or you die. Like, there's no alternative in this world, right? And like, so we talked about that with the scene with Tywin, right? And I feel that's completely summed up next in the next big confrontation, the next scene after that, which is Ned's confrontation of Cersei. Like, Ned foolishly, right? Varys even calls him out on it later on. Like, this was the beginning of the end for Ned, this official confrontation and conversation here.
This is where the episode gets its namesake, because
Ned
is sitting there next to a fountain, and Cersei comes up, and
I love the shot too when she walks up, purposely shooting it from like above, like he's looking up at her, and her head is blocking the sun.
Well, it's interesting because, like, at this point he was stabbed through the leg. He's sort of walking on a cane. He's sitting down, and they decide. Arya
even asked him, "It's like, is your leg hurting and affecting your decision making?"
Yeah. That's something that a child would say.
Yes, it is.
But for the most part, he's looking up and he's in a weak position. And then, so physically we see him in a weak position, but then he goes ahead and he's like, listen, I know the truth. Your children are basically yours and Jaime's, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he reveals all this information that he has. And he doesn't realize that he's still in the weaker position. Like, we physically see him in a weak position, and then we hear him sort of, try to, get the upper hand and say Robert's anger is going to be chasing you across.
Kind of trying to use Robert as a shield in order to protect himself. Like, dude, have you seen again, and another example of like how Ned is setting himself up for failure there. It's like, dude, you literally saw how Robert kind of overrode you on a decision between you and Cersei. Like, dude, do not expect that Robert, even if Robert did survive the ordeal that he goes through in this episode, right? Like, dude, you can't consistently hide behind Robert. Like, he does not have the might and the will that you think he does.
Well, it goes back to that scene where Robert's talking about the first person that they ever killed, right? And it's he actually mentioned, like, I'm surrounded by Lannisters. They're everywhere. They're in my guard. They're in the court. They're in whatever. And the Lannisters have basically secured a strong position in King's Landing. And here's Ned basically saying, this noble thing, like, hey, listen, your children are not the proper heirs. Stannis is, and I'm going to give you all this information. I know this is true. I'm going to bring it out. And, Cersei's like, bring it.
Go ahead.
Like,
she's
Wayne
like,
Rock Johnson, right? It's
she like, even literally says, first of all, not only is she not scared of Ned, she's not at all scared of Ned telling Robert, mostly because of the events that she's already set in motion, because at least for right now, Cersei is 10 steps ahead of everyone. Right, so she's already kind of set this chain of emotions and event that are going to result in Robert not being able to do anything about it. Needless to say, and then
my big question is,
yes,
before this,
I love this point that you have here.
Was Robert, right? Basically the plot to kill him during the hunt, was that in motion before Ned confronted her?
Yes.
Or
yes,
she confronts Ned. And then, he confronts, Ned confronts Cersei, and then Cersei just goes and sends a letter, like, make sure he doesn't return.
Think about it this way, right? Lancel was already feeding Robert, or, giving Robert the wine in the last episode before Ned even found out the truth and had even planned it. Cersei had been planning this for like a while. Well, I have a feeling that Cersei had been planning this since the first episode. Cersei had been planning this for a while. Like, there were a lot of working pieces that had to go right for this plan to work, right? Like, say Rob, like, What if Robert hadn't found anything on that hunt, right? Like, yeah, he was on the hunt, but say, like, it was just an off day, and he didn't find any game, and he comes back in one piece. It didn't matter how much wine he had. Like, if they don't find that boar, Robert Baratheon walks out of that Godswood, and her whole plan, and she's like, fuck, I gotta try again, you know? And then maybe it does fuck up. Like, there were a lot of working pieces. Like, she had to have had that plan in motion for so long. Like, I'm talking, like, potential, like, before, like, right from the minute that Jon Arryn died, potentially she'd had that in motion set up, you know?
Well, do you think it's like, oh, hey, you know, Jon Arryn's gone, things are a little bit better for our conspiracy, and then, oh, damn, Robert wants to get Ned, and then as soon as they sort of travel up there and she sizes him up, she starts with her schemes.
Right.
And then it's
because remember, the whole thing that we have to keep in mind as far as that goes, right, is because even though the first season is so focused on the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters, right, we forget that, and this is what I feel like, again, the future seasons of the show do such a good job of filling us in with, is that this ultimately, beforehand, was never meant to involve the Starks. The Starks, as Varys mentioned in episode 5, got involved almost by accident when Bran stumbled upon it, because the Starks had been out of the loop for so long. They'd been out of the loop for like the last 15 years. There hadn't been a Stark in King's Landing since the attack on the Capitol. So because the Starks had been out of the loop for so long, right, it was only by chance, when, in a way, the Lannisters almost kind of caused their own fault, because it was the death of Jon Arryn, right, which, as we know, was not caused by the Lannisters. It was caused by Littlefinger, right, in order to kind of stir up this conflict, as far as that goes, that caused the events to be set in motion, right? So the crazy thing is that even though we are continuously told in this season that the Starks are the protagonists and the Lannisters the antagonist, in hindsight, it really is a matter of now both of them are just different sides that have been pushed against each other for this reason. It just so happened that this one side had this incriminating secret that they would do anything to keep secret, right? Cersei even mentions it in the first episode, that Jon Arryn happening was like a blessing in disguise. Like, you don't say that to me at least. Like, I get it, like, right, for the purposes, like, you know, because we have this history of villains always admitting what they did behind closed doors, but, like, just because of the context of what we now know about this show, that's not something you say if you're the one that's committed the deed, you know? Like, to me, Cersei doesn't say that, right, because
Sure,
at the time, right, we didn't know about the whole Littlefinger thing, but Cersei's not saying that to Jaime or vice versa, however it happened, if they were actually to blame for it, you know? So, by proxy of that,
how Tywin basically chastises Jaime for the game that they're playing, right?
Right.
It's like,
right.
You're basically putting our family at risk.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's really because of, you know, what does he say? He says something about, like, you have the benefit of being young. But it's because of that, you know, fact that Cersei and Jaime are relatively young, that basically they're making these mistakes and they're getting their family entangled into this battle with the Starks. And I think you're right. The Starks were a wild card.
They were.
That were thrown into Cersei's and Jaime's plan.
Way.
And that sort of is what basically sparks the issues for not only everybody else in Westeros, but the Lannisters themselves.
Not to mention the peril that they put their own brother in, because Tyrion is dragged into this simply by proxy of his last name when he had nothing to do with it. And also when because by the time he found out, because he was just as in the dark as everyone else about the information. Like, I mean, I'm sure he had some idea. Like, he obviously knew about Jaime and Cersei's relationship, right? But I don't know if he knew the extent to, like, of Cersei's children's parentage as far as that goes. So that's something else to consider as far as that goes, just how that kind of drags Tyrion in and how that ends up, you know, because Tyrion, even though he doesn't start off that way, Tyrion ends up becoming a crucial piece in the downfall of their house that builds towards the end, right? That's the case in both the books and the show, because him killing Tywin is really, I mean, it technically starts with Joffrey, right? I mean, it technically starts, like, with the war, but it really does start with Joffrey, and then Tyrion killing Tywin is, like, the final, like, one of like the big final nails in the coffin that kind of leads to the destruction of the Lannisters, because from there it's just even in the books too, it's just ultimate pandemonium.
Well, there's a lot of things, like, you know, what happens to Cersei later on basically brings shame to the house.
Right. That
so
as
anyway,
well. Jaime getting his hand cut off. It's a lot along the way, but
there's a lot that happens to the Lannisters.
But so Yeah, so the next, like, kind of the second act of this, right, there's kind of like a string of, like, micro scenes that kind of add to the theme, right? You have Littlefinger in the brothel kind of, like, coaching Ross on what to do. You have, like, Theon trying to encroach upon Osha. They've been doing, like, a little bit with Theon, like, kind of, like, because Theon didn't have that much to do in the book, so they're having him do that much, and then Osha kind of reminds us, it's like, hey, the White Walkers, you know, when Lewin tries to talk to her.
But, like, the thing with Theon is, like, you know, he kind of goes in there and sort of puts her down, you know, and basically, oh, you're out of place here. And he also, like, towards the end of that conversation, tries to take advantage of her. And I think that's really, you know, showing us, like, what's going to ultimately happen to Theon. They're trying to make him, like, a little bit of a womanizer. And, sort of like this young man that sort of prides himself on, you know, his conquest, so to speak. Because, you know, if we've seen this show before, we ultimately know that's going to be, you know, his sexuality is going to take a direct assault when he gets captured by Ramsay later on.
That's a good point. I didn't think of that.
I think this is a little scene where they just sort of pepper that in there. Like, hey, he's a little bit of a young playboy, but Master Lewin there, you know, reminds him, like, you know, you're sort of a guest / prisoner too, so don't push your luck.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely great as far as that goes. I still find it funny, like the one line that Osha has, like Lewin's like, I won't be here the next time he does that, and Osha's like, oh please, I've had worse than him. Like, he's just a boy, you know, as far as that goes. Like, constantly, this season is literally just a season of everyone taking shots at Theon, and I keep thinking of, like, Theon's future actions, like, almost all stem from just, like, everyone consistently taking shots at him for, like, no reason, because he's kind of like, I know everyone kind of, like, hates his dad for, like, starting the rebellion unnecessarily, and, like, the Greyjoys are kind of like, we're going to talk about that a lot next season when the Greyjoys, like, try to make their claim, but, like, the Greyjoys to me are just, like, consistently trying to, like, be bigger than they really are when they're, like, kind of literally just up-jumped like raiders and pirates, and the fact that they keep failing miserably and getting smacked around for it, and Theon is kind of, like, the first example of that. But we have a quick scene at the wall where Jon and Sam are standing on top of the wall, and they see Benjen's horse return, famously without Benjen, the kind of the first thing to fire as to what's to come, right? But the big scene, obviously, is right after Ned confronts Cersei. Oh, how conveniently, Renly runs up covered in blood, like covered, like just caked in dry blood. I'm like, Jesus, did this boar, like, chew on Robert? Like, did he play with his food a little bit? Like how did this go as far as that goes? Like, I get it, like, he was clearly impaled, you know, they didn't have modern day medicine as far as that goes, but, and, like, he was clearly very, very, very drunk. But, like, that's always been, like, one thing that's, like, always kind of stuck out in my head. I'm like, man, if there was one scene that was cut, an off-screen scene that was cut that I just would have loved to have seen, it's freaking just the visual imagery of Robert wrestling with this boar that's, like, got its freaking tusks stuck in his stomach, and him, like, pulling out the knife and stabbing it in the eye, and also, like, how kind of, I don't know, like, is it weird? Did you find his death scene, like, underwhelming? Like, I know what happens off screen as far as that goes, but it's kind of just like him sitting there, like, tired in bed, like, slowly dying. Well, and, like, the wound doesn't look as bad, but
yeah, I think this might be, like, the first season limitations,
right?
And
that's what I'm chalking it up to.
Yeah, we come across that a couple times in the next few episodes, and I think it's just they couldn't film that scene. Like, it would have been too complicated. It would have been too expensive.
Because the whole thing is, like, that in the book, it's meant to seem that, like, the boar, like, kind of did, like, in a weird way. Like, remember the scene in Godfather 2 when Vito kills the guy who killed his dad, and he, like, kind of, like, rips it up his chest? Like, that's kind of, like, what it's supposed to be. And, like the whole thing is that, like, Robert's, like, guts are quite literally hanging out of his stomach, and then it's, like, this kind of makeshift, like, freaking sash that Meister Pycelle has constructed is the only thing that's keeping them intact. Like, he's literally, and they even say that, like, we have no idea how this dude is alive. Like, this dude should be dead, you know?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's a little bit of a issue with how it's presented, because, you know, how does a boar, like, in my mind, how does a boar take Robert down?
Right.
And
well, I mean, the whole incentive is that he was so drunk by the time, right? Because we don't know how much wine has been consumed between the last episode and now, that he's so drunk that he can't, like, get in the proper form. But also, like, again, it's just, there's so many questions that are raised. It was very clear, like, they just needed an excuse to get Robert Baratheon off screen so they could get killed, so that they could get this going as far as that goes. But it's very obvious, because there's so many different logistics, like I said, where I'm thinking about, like, okay, how was he holding his spear? Can he barely stand? Did he not, like, throw the spear in time, like, for when the boar charged him? Like,
if they shot a scene, they could have left some mystery of, like, oh, was he killed and the boar was framed, or did the boar actually get him? You know, like they could have done some mystery to his death. Like, I know, I'm serious. I think, you know, if
there's a lot of different points where I'm like, they dropped this case kind of too quickly.
Yeah,
that
he's
like
always
to the point where
surrounded by
Ned,
Lannisters,
yeah,
you know?
Ned quite literally talks to Selmy and Varys after. And he's like, how did this happen? And Selmy even says, like, the boy's squire kept giving him wine. And Varys is quite literally pointing it out. It's like, wow, so Ned can figure this out, but Selmy can't? Like, come on. Like Selmy's not a stupid guy. So
yeah, it's kind of like, it definitely comes across as a weird scene.
Yeah.
Like, Robert does have to die to set in motion the rest of the season.
Right.
And I get that, but it's sort of one of those, like, question marks. Like, this is the way you handled it, you know?
Right.
So
it was a weird moment for me, even in the books, where I'm like, this is Ned's best friend in this scene, and like this childhood friend in this scene. I don't know. It feels shortchanged as well. Like, I know it's weird because like we made such a big deal about Viserys' death last week, and like, but like for Robert to like have such an imposing presence in episode 5, like the way that he did, and then for it to like kind of end this way, I don't know. It's like, it definitely feels like a plot convenience thing more than anything, when he was established as like such this imposing and like massive force to be reckoned with, you know?
yeah, no, I agree. And you know, it's one of those things where this sort of sets in motion the whole Ned is going to, you know, basically write down Robert's sort of last will and testament. Hey, Ned is the protector of the realm. Joffrey is not necessarily to lead directly. Ned's going to sort of be the Lord Regent until Joffrey grows up.
Right.
And, you know, basically...
Which we know Cersei's going to love that.
Yeah, so exactly. And Ned basically understands that his claim to being the Lord Protector is relatively weak. And so eventually he sort of, you know, talks to Littlefinger, and Littlefinger tells him point blank, like, you need to seize power. You need to basically do X, Y, and Z, including, you know, if Joffrey seems to be, you know, a problem, hey, then we sort of get rid of him and we put Renly.
And we put Renly in there. Yeah, so I wanted to talk to you about that as far as that goes, right? So obviously we know that, like, Ned's honor, right? Because this is something that, like, kind of always bugged me, right? This is definitely the point in the books where I was like, I was starting to get bugged, because this was the point in that first book where I felt like there was a lot of problems. Like, I've been upfront about this before. Setup for me in TV shows and books has never really been like a problem with me, because I know it's so crucial, and sometimes some of my favorite parts and some of my favorite elements from storytelling in general can just come from the setup phase in general before we like kind of get to the oh shit's gonna hit the fan phase. But this is something that always kind of bugged me, right? Like, when you're right, like obviously we know Littlefinger is a hell of a lot smarter and obviously knows his way around way more than Renly Baratheon, right? We know Renly dies in the next season within the first 5 episodes, and Littlefinger makes it at the very least all the way up until the penultimate season before he's done dirty. I have more notes on that later on, but my big thing is, why in the hell didn't Ned at the very least take Renly up on his offer? Like, even, like, I get it, right? So here's the thing, right? Ned doesn't take Renly up on his offer because he believes that Stannis should be king, right? But he actually is, for a minute, fooled that Littlefinger is going to help him install Stannis as the king, right? After they take down the current regime. Like, I get it, right? It's all plausible deniability, and Ned's not going to go for it, but, like...
Littlefinger tells him that he should go with Renly.
Right. Littlefinger even tells him. So, like, it's like... And then he has the goal to be like, oh, will Renly be joining us? What? You think Renly's going to stick around for what's going to come next? Like, dude.
Like, if Ned basically teamed up with Renly, Littlefinger would have fell in line with Renly and Ned. And then the Starks would have basically been ruling King's Landing,
pretty much,
instead of the Lannisters.
Right, and we wouldn't have had a show. Basically, it's the whole.
Yeah. Well, we could have had a show because there would still be a reason to go to war.
True,
because Tywin would then sort of turn around and try to free Cersei. And
True. The difference being though that the Starks are actually in a position of prominence from the start, rather than constantly having to like have this constant uphill battle, right? Because Robb obviously has to step in and kind of take over from where Ned failed, and then everything there happens. You know, we'll have to have a contest later on at the end of season 3, right, when Robb dies with the Red Wedding, is who made the dumber decision, Ned or Robb? Because I'm constantly at a loss to see who made the dumber one. Because like every time I think I'm like, oh, Robb did a lot of things that Ned didn't by like avoiding the King's Landing in general, and then I'm like, yeah, but then he broke his wedding vow and basically gave the incentive for some of his squad to join the other side. So I'm constantly at a loss as to who made the dumber decision ultimately in the battle for the throne, Ned or Rob. But we'll get to that in a minute. Rob's not even in this episode.
Well,
but
hey, Dom, it's
trusting Littlefinger or marrying the wrong girl. It's like, especially considering that like that was another thing that was like blatantly changed from the book.
Yeah, I think it's like father like son type of thing.
Yeah,
so,
definitely.
But anyway, what I will say is, one of the other favorite parts of this episode is really the scene where Jon sort of gets his role as steward.
Yes, when they officially take their vows in the Watch.
It's like, I wanted to be a ranger.
I want to be a ranger. I keep forgetting that this is, even though I do still love Jon's arc throughout like the show up until the last season. I'm with Jon even up until season 7. It's only in season 8 when he completely loses all of his authority that he loses me. But like, I'm with Jon for the entirety. But man, I forgot what he really is like the equivalent of an emo kid in this first season. He really is.
The awesome thing is like when he's doing his emo freak out.
Yeah.
And Sam is trying to calm him down.
And then like, Pip comes in with his little story.
He's right
that
there.
was awesome.
And Jon is just like, it ain't fair. And then Pip is like, you damn right it's not
you want to talk
fair.
about fair?
Like
you want to talk, motherfucker, you want to talk about fair?
Yeah. So Pip
try growing up the way I did.
Pip reveals that he's like, was a musician of some kind, like singing at the tavern. And then some lord sort of hit on him.
Yeah,
and
made a pass, not just hit, made a pass at him.
Yeah, exactly. And he basically refused. And because of that, the Lord, lied and said, hey, this guy basically just tried to steal some stuff or whatever. He just basically threatened Pip and said, you're going to the wall or I kill you. And basically that's why Pip is there. He's revealed that because he refused someone, in sort of this sexual past, that's why he ended up at the wall. And, other than that, he would have been living a pretty comfortable life, within reason. And that's what's unfair. Like Jon just being a steward.
Right. Jon, at the end of the day, chose to be there, right?
Exactly.
Almost 100% of his brothers did not choose to be there.
And Sam makes a good point. Like, he's grooming you as
right. Meaning that he sees something in Jon, right? Like, again, like kind of the whole setting up the next generation to replace the old. Like, that is very, very much a present oppression theme in this episode, right? It's even there with Littlefinger, with the moments with Littlefinger and Theon that we talked about, right? It's even there kind of in a strange way with Daenerys' arc, right? Where Daenerys, even though, right, she's trying to, her whole majority of her arc in this episode, right, is trying to coax Khal Drogo to go and make the moves, right? And that, in a way that Viserys did not succeed, right? In a weird way, it's kind of the same thing where they're kind of setting themselves up for the future, right? Jon, obviously, with being groomed for command, and Daenerys, even though she doesn't realize it yet, to be in charge of this large, be learning how to control this large force, this large army, so that eventually she can lead them on to this conquest, right? I definitely find that very fascinating, and I think the incentive as well for her kind of, with the whole assassination attempt, right? And this is because this is also a big moment for Jorah, too, because at the end of the day, right, even though Ned... But this is the other thing that I forgot to say as well earlier with the Ned Robert scene, is that Robert ultimately on his deathbed does have a change of heart about Daenerys. I think that's the one moment, emotionally ringing moment, right, that really stands out, because he's like, let her live, because he realizes in his last moments, he's like, yeah, I've made a mistake. This is nothing to be scared of, right? At least in the moment, right?
So one of the things that, I'm glad you brought this up. So I want to segue into sort of our GOTchaverse segment, because we mentioned that we wanted to talk about oaths.
Yes.
And there's a couple of oaths that take place, or, don't take place in this particular episode. So Jorah is actually one of them. Basically he's walking around the market, and all of a sudden this little kid comes up to him and hands him a piece of paper and says, listen, this is your royal pardon. You can go back to Westeros. And then he realizes, oh, that means there's some assassin.
That means there's something's about to go down
here in the market. And so Jorah has to make a decision. Like, he sort of got kicked out and made this sort of attempt to get this pardon. He basically was a spy for Robert's, kingdom, and now he has his pardon. But he basically sees something in Daenerys. He's made this oath to her, and now that it's not really her brother that is going for the crown,
right?
It's her. Like, Jorah has seen this sort of growth in leadership in her, and he makes a decision right there on the fly to really, change what he really wanted and really give a personal oath to Daenerys, which we'll see actually, he sticks to for the rest of the series.
Yeah, Jorah for the first couple of seasons is an interesting character insofar as he's there to assist Daenerys and like give her context, right? But he also serves an interesting role because he's spying on her, but then he actually joins her forces as far as that goes. But then later on, like the way that they utilize Jorah, at least for the first couple seasons, I think is really interesting. And Eric Thorpe, our loyal follower, I actually wanted to bring up a comment that he made a little earlier than we usually do, but he asked an interesting question, which is if Robert didn't change his mind, like on his deathbed, do you think Daenerys would have been successfully assassinated at some point? The only reason why I don't necessarily know if that equates to factors in, because I mean, we said it, by the time Robert makes the decision, right, to not have Daenerys killed, Varys tells Ned it's already too late, the Raven's been sent, so like the attempt is already underway. So I the only reason why it's like I don't necessarily think it would have made a difference as far as that goes.
Well, what I will say is that I guess Cersei and Joffrey are going to know about his change of heart, and they probably don't even care about Dany.
They don't even care. The Lannisters make it clear at multiple points throughout the rest of the show that they do not care about Daenerys. Like literally the most that they do, which is again a slight change from how it happened in the books, I'm going to be bringing that up a lot, is in season 4, Tywin sends out the letter that exposes purposefully has one of Varys's kids, little birds, inform Sir Barristan, who we know is working for her at the time, that exposes Jorah. And that's the most that happens. And by the time he does that, like, it's already too late. Like, Daenerys has already, like, become a force to be reckoned with in Essos as far as that goes. Yeah. So the Lannisters do not care one bit about Daenerys in a way that, like, kind of Ned and Robert did. But then, obviously, they died and the Lannisters took over King's Landing. So
also another thing about oaths, right? We've been talking, that's what we're sort of focused on.
Yeah.
Like, we've been talking about how Ned, he's sort of oath driven, he's loyal to his friend. He's loyal to the sort of order of succession. It's one of those things that sort of is what gets him killed. And then we have Jon, right? He's at the wall. And in this episode, he goes before the old gods and he takes his oath of the Night's Watch. And almost immediately, when they see Benjen's horse return without a rider, he's ready to go out. He wants to go find, and it's like, oath be damned. And, as we see in the next episode or two, when Robb marches to war, at some point, basically Jon is ready to throw the oath away and sort of go to war with his brother. But again, the Night's Watch, his new brothers in arms, Sam, Pip, and some of the other fellows, basically drag him back to the wall and basically say, like, this is your new life now. You have to basically accept that you took the oath and you have to live up to the oath. So I guess that's one of the questions I have is, like, this season is about Ned, sticking to his honor and his oath, and really, that's his downfall. But then we're also setting up Jon, who's now locked into this oath, and he is sort of forced to stick with it. And, where do we see that going for Jon? Does sticking to his oath ultimately benefit him, or is it ultimately going to do him harm?
So it's tricky because I feel like there's two different ways to approach that, right? Because we see two different ways of it being approached, both in the show and in the books, right? It's weird because the only difference between the two is that in the books we don't really get to see the after effects of it, right? Because they do still line up, like, with the same outcome, with him being stabbed, right, by his fellow brothers in the Night's Watch in season 5, but it happens for vastly different reasons in the books than it does in the show. Because the thing is that Jon, in a weird way, kind of has something that Ned and Robb don't, which is, he has a red priestess to quite literally bring him back to life after his screw up and mistake, right? Because Jon, in a weird way, up until that moment, is following the same track that both Ned and Robb did, right? They were following their honor. They were trying to do the right thing. They let their honor get the best of them. They didn't take into account the people around them might not all be all that trustworthy, and then it backfired and got them killed. The only difference is that Jon had a red priestess to bring him back to life. It happened with
Jon
Ned.
Jon gets a second chance.
Jon gets a second chance.
He learns from his error.
Right.
And then goes in a completely different direction. So
right, for the most part, like we'll get to that with the later phases, but I feel like that's a big thing because the whole thing is that in the books, in the show, it's the idea that they stab him over the wildlings. But the ironic thing is that, and I find it really interesting that you brought that up, which is that, so you know how in the show, Jon doesn't even get the letter about that kind of brings him into the fold with Ramsay and everything until after he comes back to life?
Yeah.
In the books, that's the event that gets him killed, that very event. Because the whole thing is throughout all of book 5, right? Which is Jon's arc throughout season 5. He's elected Lord Commander. He's doing, he executes Janos Slynt. He's doing all of these things in order to get the wall ready and prep for the invasion. Because his whole thing is, right? Stannis makes him the offer to become Jon Stark, the King of Winterfell. And his whole thing is, he's fully in the mindset of, screw the realms. We have to get ready for the White Walker attack, because that is coming, like he is throwing all of his might into the wildlings, right, and into protecting the wildlings, and the whole thing is that even though the Night's Watch doesn't like it, the Night's Watch is behind him enough because there's been enough of them that survived the fists of the First Men that understood the threat. So the Night's Watch is not necessarily divided in the books as it is in the show. The difference being is that there's a series of events. Obviously, the interactions with bringing the wildlings south don't go smoothly, right? You have all this weird, like, kind of Red Priestess stuff with Mance. Like, there's a lot of magic that's introduced in that book. And then it ends with Jon, after putting all of his effort into staying out of the conflict, right? He doesn't know if Stannis is still alive, if Stannis survived the attack, because Stannis is stuck in the snow, and unlike the show, it's left ambiguous as to whether Stannis is still alive or not. We last leave off with Stannis actually capturing Theon's sister. The way that it ends is he receives the letter. Ramsay tells him that that Stannis is dead, and but there's a whole other thing with Rickon, and that is what causes Jon to basically say, okay, we can't stay out of this anymore. I have to do something, and it's his decision to go south and fight Ramsay with the wildlings that causes the Night's Watch to turn on him and betray him. So as far as the oaths go, like I said, it's definitely, I can't really say because it's still for the most part following the books, but there is kind of a difference as far as how Jon treats the oaths across the different property. Because like I said, and we'll get into this at a later point, but to me, the divergence from the books happened long before season 6.
Gotcha.
It's a lot, like, but that's my 2 cents on kind of how oaths are treated in this world.
Like, definitely, it's a great time to bring it up because he does take his oath. The oath is the downfall of Ned. There's a little bit of a parallel here in the TV series, but like you say, it's going to sort of have an impact as we continue to go on throughout the series.
Yes,
and definitely, I didn't read the books. You read the books, obviously, and it's interesting to hear the differences between.
Yeah, it's a lot
how it's handled in both properties, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into this later on in season 5, but honestly, like I think the biggest detriment that the show committed, like I said, was before they went off the books was trying to merge season 4 and 5 into one season. I think that I understood why, because chronologically those 2 books happened at the same time. It's just that by that point in the series, there was just so much happening that they kind of had to diverge in the books, but like there was so much that got cut, and the worst part is they added something that, like, I mean, we'll get into that at a later point, but there's so much interesting stuff that happened in that book that was like setting us up for like a crazy finale. But really the only other big thing, right, is so Ned obviously sending the letter to Stannis, right? Still, we don't actually see Stannis in physical form in this season, but the big thing, right, is so Ned specifically goes out of his way to write on the will that Robert has him write, leave it in the name of Robert's heir, right? Thinking that, like, his good wordage will both spare Robert the pain of knowing the truth and also kind of save his face with Cersei, right? As far as that goes. But I definitely think it's interesting how Ned is so devout to the line of succession when,
Well, I like how he's dedicated to bureaucracy to the point where... 20 years later, it's like they find out he's not the right heir. And
that's the funniest part is the fact that Ned, right? You mentioned it before, right? It's kind of the whole thing that goes in line with it, right? Ned's dedication to his oaths gets him killed. It's like Ned just doesn't seem to have this understanding that it's like, bro, you literally just had a giant war to take the throne, right? And the only reason why they were able to, like, kind of how he was kind of able to delude himself is that Robert and the Baratheons are distant cousins of the Targaryens, which is what gives Robert the claim, right? But Jorah even says it in that scene with Daenerys, right? Kind of linking everything together, which is that when Aegon the Conqueror conquered Westeros, do you think that they gave him because because he believed that it was in line? No, he took it because he wanted to. And that's kind of, if we can kind of peek into the focus character segment a bit, right? Our focus character for tonight is Cersei Lannister. Cersei Lannister doesn't have that much screen time in this episode, but the reason why I chose her is because to me, her two biggest moments of this season come from this episode. The first one we already talked about, obviously being the confrontation with Ned, but the second one being the final throne room scene, right? After Robert's death, right? Ned, Littlefinger, Varys, and all these city watch members walk into the throne room, right, in this big grand show. Ned gives them the letter that Robert wrote for the will. He gives it to Sir Barristan, and Cersei just literally takes one look at the letter. She doesn't even care about the wordage or anything. She just rips it up and is like, look, we're staking our claim. This is ours now. Joffrey is king. And you could either get in line or you can either get in line or you can get out of the way the hard way, literally, as we see. Joffrey, this is also kind of the first indication of Joffrey's petulance, right? Because we know that Joffrey is all about just making emotional decisions on the whim, right? Because it's Joffrey's decision in 2 episodes that in a way starts the war, right? It's kind of how every character has their part to play. But this is the moment where Cersei literally says, it's like, is this meant to be your shield? A piece of paper. It's kind of, she's consistently giving Ned the warning. It's like, and that was literally her last chance. She's like, this is your last chance. Get in line, proclaim Joffrey king. She's giving him the opportunity to get out while the getting is good, and he still will not. At that point, it's literally I constantly think back to this story, the ones that one of my friends told me about how this one guy at a party, he wasn't white, but he was kind of quite liberally using the N-word, and he was told repeatedly to stop, otherwise he was gonna get beat up, and after a while, it's just like, look, there's nothing else we can do. Have at him. The one guy that was trying to constantly go to bat for him, but it's like, dude, you dug your own grave as far as that goes. But I feel like that's kind of a good comparison as to what's happening here with Ned, because he just it's not even to the point where the writing's on the wall. It is literally the paper is in front of him. The paper is right in front of him, up close and personal to his face.
When you talk about the confrontation between Cersei and Ned is bringing up this whole idea. I know why, Jon Arryn got killed. I know what he was seeking, and Cersei basically says, you either win or you die.
Yeah.
And
it's like, who cares?
Basically, she has the confidence that she is going to win. And she's basically telling him that. Yeah. And, what is your option? If I'm going to win, basically Cersei's saying, if I'm going to win, Ned, you are going to die. That's the problem.
You know what it is? You know why I love this moment? Because it just brings up to me, it's kind of, it's this consistent theme that I've found that goes across kind of all of the great shows that I love, right? It's been in Sopranos, it's been in Breaking Bad, it's been in The Wire, it's a big moment for me in Mad Men, right? I don't know if you've watched Mad Men, but at the end of season 1, there's a moment, right, where Pete Campbell, who's another employee of Sterling Cooper, who's under Don Draper, finds out famously about that Don Draper, faked his identity. And he tries to bring it up to Burt Cooper in the sense of he's just a little weasel that's trying to work his way up the company ladder and kind of subservient Don. But Burt literally tells him straight up to his face, it's like, who cares? If I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to get ahead, and by doing this, and it's not going to work. As far as that goes, it's kind of this constant show of relying on this rule book. It's a big part of The Wire, right? Kind of relying on this rule book, right? This supposed set of purported principles that everyone you think will abide by is not going to save you. And in fact, if you depend on that, if you live your life by that way, then you're going to get hurt in a lot of different ways, because not everyone plays by the same rules. In fact, hardly anyone does. And when it comes to situations like this, you're right. All that matters is winning and getting on top. And people don't care how they do it at all. So it's like, you either got to play it smart or make sure that if you're getting in it that way, that you're going to win this, because there's only one other solution.
Yeah, and I feel like this episode, Cersei is not necessarily in a lot of the episode.
Right.
But for the most part, this episode is setting up the whole idea that, hey, Ned, your final enemy is Cersei.
Yeah.
Now that Robert is sort of on his deathbed and he's out the door and he's pretty much 99% going to die, you essentially have to do something to stop Cersei from taking the throne. And throughout the rest of the episode, we see him scramble. It's all about, Renly sort of offering to sort of give him the men, as long as, the understanding is Renly becomes king.
Right.
Forget Stannis. Forget, everything else about how things should be. This is the way it is.
Right.
And he denies that. And then Littlefinger basically tells him, listen, the power's there for you to seize. Like, let's make Renly king. Let's get rid of Joffrey, make Renly king. And Ned still refuses to give up this notion of, the proper succession. And
right.
Cersei is just, she doesn't have to be there.
Right. But her hold is felt as far as that goes. And I'll tell you how else that factors in. Because it factors into the one other way in which Cersei can get to Ned in a way that there is nothing that Ned can do about that, which is Ned's sympathy for innocence. Because at the end of the day, as heinous as Joffrey is at later points, right? At the end of the day, in the current moment, Joffrey is still innocent of anything. He has no knowledge of his parentage. He's not king yet. He just watched his supposed father die, right? Joffrey is still innocent of this moment, right? And his whole thing is, and George R.R. Martin has talked about this frequently as far as, what influences Ned's decision, is Ned was disgusted by Robert's reaction and to the murdering of the Targaryen children, right? But Ned's whole thing is that as much of a soldier as he is, he cannot stand to see innocents get hurt, right? Like, I'm talking like women, specifically women and children. And his whole thought process in confronting Cersei was trying to give her a warning in order to protect her and her children from Robert, knowing that Robert was going to do it. So, like, just that whole mentality there, right? So I'm like, so you're going to let this kind of bullshit honor system, right, allow you to, in a way, almost actively contribute to the more murder of women and children. Because, again, say for some instance that Robert had, had made it out of that Godswood and that encounter alive, right? First of all, I still don't know if he would have given the reaction that he would have given, and that, like, it would have gone differently per se. But, like, say that whatever delusion Ned was thinking of how this would go would actually happen, right? Thinking that Robert would be able to single-handedly face off against Tywin Lannister, of all people, right? That's something that even Jon Arryn would have, that not even Jon Arryn would have done, right? I
think the whole idea Ned would, let's say Robert didn't get injured, he's perfectly healthy, he tells him about it. Basically, Ned would say, I'm going to get my bannermen, everyone that backs me, and we're going to basically clean up King's Landing. And we're going to get you out from under this sort of the thumb of the Lannisters that we've seen set up throughout the rest of the season.
Right.
And I think that's sort of his big ploy. But once it becomes a little more of the squabbling, as Robert put it, where it's, basically the Lannisters will do anything to seize power.
Right.
Any dirty trick, there's no honor. Basically, once it gets into that game, Ned doesn't know how to play.
Right.
And therefore, that's ultimately what leads to what happens in the next couple episodes.
No, you're right. You're 100% right as far as that goes. It's a simple matter of Ned vastly underestimated his enemies, and then he ends up in the position where he is at the end of the episode with a knife at his throat, basically. So that's pretty much it as far as everything that we could talk about really with the episode. I wanted to bring up a couple of comments, obviously, from our loyal devotee, that being Eric Thorpe. What's it called? As he said, he thinks Ned was trying to give Cersei an out in his mind by giving her a heads up to prepare before he revealed the truth. That's 100% correct. It's just a matter of, I guess he just didn't realize that it's like, oh, he was trying to give the other side an edge when the other side was already like 10 steps ahead of him, and he just didn't realize it as far as that goes. Another thing that he brought up that I thought was really interesting is kind of how it's literally the trilogy of the odd number full-length seasons of Stark's blowing it. Season 1, Ned. Season 3, Robb. And Season 5, Jon. I thought that was really funny, and it's very, very true. What's it called? Yeah, more honor. That's a word, quite frankly, that I feel like the show got sick of as far as that goes. And then he said,
after this season, right? Once
Ned's gone, honor is out the window, quite literally, even with the stars. And he also brought up another funny point where you're like, yeah, everyone that's in this episode eventually dies by the end of the show, which is like, if it weren't for Sam being in the episode, that literally everyone dies, since Jon does die as well. That is a good point, because I completely forgot about that. Yeah.
Wait, Sam doesn't die at some point?
No, he does not die at any point. I think
Wow.
it's weird because it's weird because actually in the books, if I can get like quickly onto that tangent, there is a point where Sam does come across a faceless man in disguise. That's how it ends. That's the last point that we see Sam in the book. Sam literally gets to it happens a little differently in the books. How is Sam as far as when Sam leaves to go to the Citadel. But Sam basically gets to the Citadel, right? He meets his one maester, tells him about Daenerys, right? He's like, peace out, I'm going to find Daenerys. And then he basically meets with this faceless man that's posing as somebody, and then it ends. And that chapter just ends as far as that goes. So there's a lot that we get into as far as Sam's journey and what he goes through in the books, because there's a lot, obviously, that is also left out that's kind of condensed. But I also just did want to give a quick shout out to AJ as well. AJ, thanks for tuning in again. Winter is coming. Love the series. Keep up the good work. Thanks, man. And then the only really that we have left to get through is the death count, which we had a significant amount of death in this episode. We said goodbye to another main cast member. We're 2 for 2 so far, 2 back-to-back in a row. Viserys last week, and this week we said we bid goodbye to Robert Baratheon, Mark Addy. A strong 7-episode run, definitely. It's kind of hard to imagine that, like, for somebody who has such a strong presence throughout the entirety of the rest of the show, right? Robert Baratheon is only in 7 episodes of the 73, and Ned, who we'll get to, obviously, in 2 episodes, is only in 9 episodes. It's not counting the younger versions of himself that appear. As far as, Sean Bean and Mark Addy, they're both only in those amount of episodes. It's kind of insane when you consider that, as far as that goes. And we had a couple of other deaths. Obviously, we famously had the rest of poor Ned's guards. I just feel so bad for Ned's guardsmen, because every single one of them that comes to King's Landing is just brutally murdered. And it's not even just like the guardsmen. It's like all just like kind of the regular members of his house that came with him. Just like everyone that was stuck in King's Landing that didn't go out with Beric Dondarrion is just murdered. Just like they don't stand a chance.
The only one that survives is the one that goes to Stannis. So
who knew that guy was getting such a good deal?
Who when he picked out the straws, like, who was gonna go? Like,
wasn't a matter if he picked out the straws, or it's just a matter of Ned just selected this one guy. He's like, that's the most reliable guy. And that guy was like, that guy probably is still on Dragonstone. Just look back, he's like, oh man, dodged a bullet there, or dodged some spears there.
He probably had to seek out the only therapist in the realm, to be honest with you. But anyway, I don't know, whatever. I guess it would be a maester.
It would be, yeah. It would probably be a maester as far as that goes, because I don't think therapy exists in medieval times, basically. But unless you have anything else to add, that was pretty much our talk, our latest episode of Talkin Thrones on You Win or You Die, basically. We only got 3 episodes left of season 1. It's kind of insane.
I think this episode is sort of a sleeper episode. Like, obviously,
it is.
Last week was sort of, the Golden Crown and such a big death. And, we get another big death in this episode, but it's really it's more about the implication of what's going to happen next.
Yes.
And really, this is what sets in motion this is the spark of that war between the Lannisters and the Starks. And we're going to see really how it unfolds. And it could actually, there was an actual chance that it could have ended, in a very diplomatic way, or at least a less bloody way. But that's thrown out the door because of the whims of a child.
Because of the whims of a child, ultimately. Yeah, well, we'll talk about that in a couple episodes when we get to it. Eric, thank you for bringing that up. That's actually hilarious as far as that goes. I think Sam would be a really good therapist. Maybe he's the one to bring therapy into Westeros when he becomes Grand Maester at the end of the show. Maybe who knows?
Maybe he picks up that book, The Secrets of Therapy.
The Secrets of Therapy. In that endless kind of amount of, like, just lost scrolls and texts at the library.
Yeah,
so many missed opportunities.
That's Bob's work. He just never finished it, and then Sam picks it up. And
it's all about kind of how people think and soldiers, the after effects of soldiers dealing with battle. But people, once again, thank you for tuning into another episode of Talkin Thrones. We'll be back next week for episode 8, entitled The Pointy End, and then we've got 2 more episodes after that, and then we're going to take a 1-week break. There's going to be a 1-week break in between seasons 1 and 2, so keep that in mind. I'll continue to say that in the next couple weeks in order to reinforce that, but we're doing a big shoot that weekend, so neither of us will be available for that weekend, so we're going to be taking a break, so we'll be coming back 2 weeks after the end of season 1 for the premiere of season 2, but we'll be back next week, same time as usual, for episode 8, The Pointy End, and you can keep up to date with everything that's going on both with this show and with the main show, the Talkin TV podcast, by following us on Instagram and Facebook at Talkin TV Podcast. You can also click the like button and the subscribe button on this video. to just help out the channel in general overall. And like I said, keep up to date with everything that we've got going on with the channel on our social media profiles. Pat, where can the good people find you?
Hey, listen, I'm just directing everybody to my Instagram at Patrick W. Huber. I'll post on it. Maybe. Someday.
Maybe.
Or maybe I'll figure out another social
We'll see.
media which I use. But Instagram is the spot to check out some things right now.
Absolutely. And you can follow me on Facebook and Instagram on my personal pages, Movie Nerd Reviews, all one word. I post some occasional sarcastic posts here and there, but it's mostly just a fun page in order to promote everything that I do here on the Talkin TV channel. I wanted to thank everyone that's continuing to show up for these reviews. Again, we've got a ton more episodes to do. We're not stopping anytime soon. So remember, people, as always, 12 scenes in a short film, watch more fucking movies, and winter is indeed still coming. We'll catch you guys next time.